Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody, and welcome to PERIPERI U Talks. PERIPERI U Talks is a web series focused on sharing knowledge, creating dialogues, and enhancing capacity in disaster risk, climate change, resilience, sustainability, and other related fields. PERIPERI U Talks is brought to you in association with PERIPERI U Partners and Stellenbosch University. To find out more about PERIPERI U, please visit our website, riskreductionafrica.org. Today, we are very happy to have Gatkuoth Kai, a technical coordinator for the African Union's Disaster Risk Reduction Unit, to talk to us about the African Indigenous perspective on disaster risk and climate change nexus. This session will discuss how African Indigenous knowledge and practices for resilience may be applied to mitigate climate-sensitive disaster risks amid climate change and disaster risk reduction policies by African communities and their governments. Before we begin, I wish to briefly go over some of the rules and etiquette of the session. That was the description of today's session. And so with regards to today's webinar etiquette, I please ask all the participants to please keep your microphones muted throughout the session, as also to turn off your video. Please use the chat. Sorry, I've been muted. Did you guys hear what I was saying just now?
Yes, bro.
Okay, sorry, I think I just suddenly got muted all of a sudden. Just to go over some of the webinar etiquette again, to ask all participants to please keep your microphones muted and your videos off, so as not to distract the presenter. Please use the chat function in Zoom to ask any questions, to type them down. Then we will raise these questions at the end of the session. Also, feel free that during the question and answer session to please raise your hand. At the end of the session, we will have question and answer session so that you can ask your questions verbally, or as I say, we can read out the questions that you asked in the chat itself. So without further ado, I'll ask Mr. Gatkuoth Kai from the African Union. Are you ready to present? I'm just going to stop sharing my screen so that you can share your presentation there, Mr. Kai. Sorry, Kai, I believe that you're on mute. There we go.
Yes, absolutely. Yes. Thank you so much, Alberto and PERIPERI U, for providing this important platform for me to present some of the ideas and practices that are going on with regard to Indigenous perspective. Just to make sure that I start the perspective very well, I want to make sure that I'm very audible enough. Are you getting me? Alberto, are you getting me clear?
Perfectly, you can continue.
Oh, excellent. A couple of years ago, I think it's somewhere in 2019, I began to take a very sharp interest in this subject, particularly on African Indigenous perspective on disaster risk management. I was having a discussion with Professor Benoit Jalali, and he was narrating to me a very important element of indigenous engineering in Algeria. And to my surprise, I was quite motivated with how he was able to bring that out. And it made me really to think more about the lot of untapped potential that we have on the continent with regard to indigenous skills and knowledge that we have in Africa. Over the past several months, I've been looking some of the documents, trying to research online, and also having further interest really to see how best we can promote the available indigenous knowledge that we have, particularly on issues to do with climate change and disaster risk nexus. Let me see if I can share my screen. Yes. And then I began to look at the number of data that is available to see the available scientific discourses on this particular subject, I was able to get some data on IMDAT. We all know this, especially for DRR people. And then looking at the available data on climate in NASA, particularly the temperatures. And as we all know, we have seen an increase in global temperature over the years, particularly starting from early 1990s. So I began to look at century data, looking at 1920 to 1919 to 2019. So in this case, just want to see how climate hazards are behaving in light of changing climate. And as you can see from the graph, there is a bit of consistency toward the end. But again, we also need to be very cautious on whether we can conclude that this could be due to climate change or not. And looking at the data itself, we have realized that despite the consistent rise in average global temperature, especially from 1920 to 1996, the number of climate hazards has almost remained about 30 per annum. That is disasters, I mean, the climate disasters. And then, of course, we have seen a sudden rise thereafter up to the end of the century. And of course, this could be also attributed to better reporting. It could also be because of the increased development, because as more communities developed, as we urbanize, I think we are also creating more exposure to risk. And again, it could also be the widening vulnerability. As you can see, the poverty gap is widening. And this could also be an example why there is a sudden rise in a number of disasters. And of course, it can also be because of climate change, as you can see the relationship toward the end. But of course, this also needs to be understood. I think we have heard enough political statement where every single climate hazard is attributed to climate change, and this can be very dangerous. So we also need to be very careful to ensure that ongoing efforts. I think we have seen a lot of development in event attribution science. This is still very young. We have seen a lot of attribution studies going on, although they have not made a very strong headway. I think they need to be really expanded. And again, also lack of data in Africa is a big issue. In other parts of the world, I think they are making a lot of progress in attributing some of the events to climate change. So with this, looking at the available climate information, it's quite clear. The key question here is, where are the African people? What are they saying about this? The events that are happening really also affect their life, because the central argument here is that climate change also affects the way things happen naturally, physically. This is a physical issue. And the people that live on land and environment should have better say. They should be able to know how their homeland has changed. And this perspective really is not being strongly driven. We have seen an African voice that is driven by politicians and scientists, leaving our indigenous, I mean the local people. I also need to be very mindful of the word indigenous here, but the indigenous actually just to make this presentation, refer to the people, the traditional people, the communities that live maybe in rural or also some part of urban areas as well. So let's just not focus more on the word indigenous, but you can call it local, you can call it community, you can call it traditional. So in this case, we looking at the available information, the African communities have a rich knowledge systems in managing disaster risk. And this includes the choice of crops. We have seen how indigenous crops can withstand some of the hazards. And this is also very important that we build on those crops to be able to address some of the challenges that come with growing disaster risk. And again, we know how these communities are also very mindful of issues to do with hunting, the weather. They have capacity to monitor, to know. I mean, they can have rainmakers, of course, but again, they have this knowledge. They have been using this knowledge for years. But again, the truth is that also this knowledge can also be threatened by climate change, because these events are overwhelming local communities. But again, it is very important to know the extent to which these events are overwhelming local communities. And I think this is something that has been really very lacking. And of course, as we all know, African indigenous knowledge, as well as other knowledge systems, are based in nature, as I said before. And of course, these are informed by an experience of thousands of years based on observation. We all know science is also informed by observation. And I think that part of observation is very important if we bring our communities, our indigenous knowledge on board. So despite all this, that knowledge, we have seen that there is absent of participation or inclusion of this knowledge in the real world. We have seen in Sendai Framework, it is mentioned that that indigenous knowledge is important. We have also seen in Paris Agreement, several documents, including national strategies. You can go, the list is long, you will never miss a document without mentioning indigenous knowledge. But the truth of the matter is that, do we use this knowledge for even informing the formulation of that policy? Do we use this knowledge to make decision, investment decision? Of course, no. Why? I mean, this is really the key issue. And some of the challenges that come with this is that the indigenous knowledge very much depend on oral tradition. And there is really lack of documentation of this when it comes to, there is lack of documentation of indigenous knowledge, and this affects the application of this knowledge as well. We have seen advances in African universities. There are complete school or departments that are dedicated, really very important. I think this is the way to go. But in other parts of the world, we have also seen indigenous knowledge, particularly knowledge on climate change and disaster risk management, is really making a lot of progress. And some of the case studies that we have seen in the Andes, especially in the Amazonia, in Amazon forest, indigenous observation have been confirmed to be consistent with modern meteorological observations. And of course, in Arctic, right here in particular, indigenous observation actually challenge scientific conclusion, which attributed a certain weather, strange weather phenomenon to climate change. But local communities said, no, this is not due to climate change. And after several back and forth exchanges, it was actually confirmed that the indigenous observation was correct. These are very important. And in Africa, we need to adopt this kind of knowledge so that we'll be able to compare notes, we'll be able to see the scientific advances that we have, as well as what our communities are feeling on the ground.
Il faut vraiment qu'il est spécifique avec des pistes spécifiques et ainsi que de changement.
There seems to be some interruption.
Oh, apologies, Kai. I'm trying to find who it is interrupting. I can't find.
Okay.
Sorry
I think
about
it is stopped now. I think the interruption has stopped. But also, as I said earlier, the African Indigenous Knowledge.
Apologies, Kai. I can't find the person who's got their speaker on. Sorry, I'm just trying to find the source of it. Okay, I think it's fixed. Sorry, apologies about that.
It's okay. And of course, with this perspective, the indigenous knowledge, particularly the African indigenous knowledge, is facing a number of challenges. one of which is actually this era of colonization. And of course, there is what I would call the neo-colonial mindset in African institutions. Because even we don't believe in our own knowledge. And in this case, let's say we have a strategy that we want to develop. We simply go and use scientific methodologies, and we may miss really the other knowledge aspect. And we have professors here. We know that indigenous knowledge actually require different approaches, and I think a lot has been written that the way we collect information regarding indigenous knowledge is completely different. It's not just having questionnaires, send them online and all that. It is a very rigorous process. And I think with this, we simply leave out this important knowledge and we begin to adapt scientific methodologies that are actually foreign to some of our African society. And because of this, I would actually say that we are responsible in making sure that we leave out this important element. And as you know, in the Sendai Framework principles, leave no one behind, we need to make this, I think it's time now to start thinking that before even developing a policy, we need to make sure that everybody is involved. We need to make sure that there is a comprehensive process in data collection, including using indigenous knowledge to inform that decision. And with that, nearly, if not whole, the DRM and climate change policies are neither informed by African indigenous knowledge or either they use that knowledge for decision making. What we have seen consistently is just mentioning the knowledge and it is not being applied. So this is really quite dangerous because you have a community that has their own way of doing things. They have their own way of looking at the reality. And then you begin to tell them, no, that reality is not correct. So this is the African program of action, and you must implement it the way it is. I think we are just putting a block, in participation of these communities. So it's really very important, particularly at local level, that decision regarding implementation of disaster risk reduction policies and climate change policies are actually informed by relevant indigenous knowledge. And if they don't exist, if they are not rooted, I think it's time for us to look for them and try to empower communities, because this will actually implement, it will increase implementation of these policies, because community will see themselves in the policy, and it will also encourage ownership as well as sustainability. So by strengthening that indigenous perspective, I think we are starting from the science. I think the science is very clear, as I said earlier. There is a very clear scientific consensus that climate change is increasing, and it's increasing because of concentration of anthropogenic greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. That is not disputable now, regardless of some few voices. Similarly, there is also observed upward trends in climate-related disasters. The African communities in particular have not adequately shared their perspective on climate change and disaster risk nexus. This is very important. So we have seen scientists, politicians driving the way, and the few indigenous people that are taken on board are only participating in conferences, and then they come back. At the end of the day, there is no really, a combination of scientific knowledge and what the community feels is the reality to them. So that there is a disconnect. And that is why if you assess very honestly the implementation of these global and regional continental policies, they are not felt at grassroots. As somebody in the community, whether they will tell you about Paris Agreement or the Sendai Framework, they will not tell you. What they will tell you is whether their flooding has increased or drought is increasing in numbers. They don't know what you call it, climate change adaptation, neither disaster risk reduction. What they know is they have a resilient way of doing things, and that is what they know. So it is until we begin to bring what they know and what we know, and then that is really the way to be able to implement these policies. And of course, as I said earlier, there is a need to move from just mentioning important from indigenous knowledge for climate change and DRM to investing in the African indigenous knowledge and apply it for decision making. As we all know, once we have a very powerful indigenous base or knowledge that is incorporated in this global discussion and regional discussion, this is going to be very important, especially in loss and damages. It can also inform the African position when it comes to issues of loss and damages. Now, the application of indigenous knowledge for decision making will, of course, increase community participation and implementation of policies such as Sendai Framework and the Paris Agreement. And with that, I think we need to make sure that we all work together, African governments, partners, regional entities, international organizations, to ensure that there are established programs that really empower the African indigenous knowledge for climate change and DRM. And this is going to be really very important given that we have this climate change situation. So we also need to make sure that the government undertake comprehensive mapping and documentation of climate, of indigenous knowledge for climate change, including further research on how the African indigenous knowledge influences decision on DRM at local level. And there is actually a need for government to take lead in working with the academic institution to incorporate the African indigenous knowledge in national and local DRR strategies. And we also need to make sure that indigenous communities are also empowered and supported in ensuring that they collect data analysis and also, store that indigenous knowledge, because at this stage, there is really a danger that we lose this important knowledge. So it's important that we start documenting and having community owning this process. And then, of course, there is need for established legislation that will back the application of indigenous knowledge for decision making. So with this, as I always said, we need to acknowledge that there is a lot of knowledge out there for communities, because they have been surviving in turbulent weather in a serious for many years, and also they are also continue to thrive even under this climate change situation. So I think it's time for us to be able to go back, work together with these communities, and try to use that knowledge that they have to be able also to increase implementation of policies. It's a subject area that needs really to be understood. There is a lot we don't know yet. And in the next couple of months or years, we'll continue to engage in this topic. Thank you very much, Alberto and the PERIPERI U team for providing this important platform.
Thank you very much, Kai, for that really, really fascinating talk. And I think everyone can agree that I think you're absolutely right that African indigenous knowledge does not get the spotlight it truly deserves. I think it is certainly an issue that needs to be given a lot more attention and a lot more support for, I think, because I think so many of the solutions to problems across the continent can be generated by collecting, by analyzing, and by including local and indigenous knowledge to help reduce risk and to increase vulnerability. So now we're entering into the question and answer phase of our discussion session. And so I now open the floor up to anyone that wishes to perhaps to ask Kai any questions. If you have any suggestions or any inputs, please feel free to raise your hand or to ask a question in the chat. I see there's a question from Patricia Zweig. Patricia, would you like to speak?
Hi, yes, thank you for a really, really interesting discussion. It's totally
Can I ask?
funny feedback. Sorry, I'd just like to know some of the ways in which you've actually worked with communities on the ground up to now, and if you could share some of your experiences. We all learn from each other, and I'd be very keen to hear the ways in which you've been working with communities up till now, the kinds of methods that you use, and whether those need to change depending on the community that you're working in.
The challenge we have here, from where I work with the African Union, and we are not an implementing organization. What we do is to make sure that we bring together all African stakeholders to be able to inform policy dialogue and discussion. And we have one of the groups, the indigenous group, and I'm very happy Tabu is here. So most of the time, we make sure that the indigenous communities, the indigenous perspective of the African people is reflected in some of the discussion we have, especially in Africa regional platforms, as well as other continental meetings. Tabu has been very, very instrumental in this process. And I had an exchange with him several days ago. And one of the issues that came up is actually raised also by Dr. Tabu here, that even the African indigenous aspect need to be very much reflected in the Africa Science and Technology Advisory Group that has just been established. So we have been working with this community, we are working with this network, but the actual implementation is done by the network themselves. So in this case, I would request that you allow Joda to come in.
There is another question that came up in the chat by Nigel Crawhall, and he asks, a number of countries in Latin America and the Caribbean are developing national strategies and policies on indigenous knowledge. Are there African countries interested in policy development? The Latin American countries have been influenced by the IPBES assessments. Would you like to answer that, Mr. Kai?
I'm trying to locate the question. Can you come again?
Oh, no problem. So it is.
Oh yeah, he's here. He's here. Yes. Okay. Yeah. Okay. From Nigeria. Yeah. Well, we would be happy to learn from that experience as well. And I think I can answer them together with the question that was also raised by Professor Jilali. In that line, I think through the African Science and Technology Advisory Group, we can work together to ensure that the available knowledge is registered and documented before even we push for implementation. Now, with regard to whether African countries are interested in this policy on indigenous knowledge, at the moment, African countries are developing, aligning their strategies with the Sendai Framework. And I think it is time, really, it is time that we need to start ensuring that the indigenous knowledge is also taken on board, particularly when it comes to making those decisions at local level. Whether they are interested, I don't know, but I think this is something we are trying now to bring to their attention. Back to you, Beto.
Thank you very much, Kai. One quick question. There was a question asked by one of our colleagues in French a little bit earlier, and he was asking whether if there was a French version of this presentation. And unfortunately, I told him that there isn't because today's session is in English. But I think it would be very useful to know is that I think one of the challenges that we certainly have in quite a lot of the fields, and disaster risk included, is that there's this issue of languages, and where if information is accessible in multiple languages, and perhaps for any of our French speakers who are attending the session, could you direct them as to where one can find more information about African indigenous knowledge? On a website, are there French versions, English versions? Is there any sort of documentation that they can read up afterwards, perhaps?
Unfortunately, I don't have a French version. I would have loved really to have it. But this is the constraint I have on my side. Yeah.
No problem at all. No, that's absolutely fine. But I think I'm just seeing if there are any other further questions from any of the other participants. I see Tabi Joda. I know your question was, your hand was raised earlier. Would you like to ask Mr. Kai a question? Hello, Tabi Joda. Your hand was raised earlier? Would you like to ask a question? Okay, I'm not too sure. No one's unmuting themselves. If anyone else has any other questions, please feel free to post it in the chat. Also, just to let everyone else know, I see that Aurelian Romeo has posted something in the chat, just saying that you can access other Peri U Talks videos on the YouTube page. Please feel free to do so. We have several of our recording sessions there, so you can see several of our other sessions done by some other of our other guest speakers. There is a question from Jalali Benoit, or maybe a statement. He says, I think we should encourage master students at African universities to work on African Indigenous knowledge, and particularly on the gain when African Indigenous knowledge for climate change was implemented. I can completely agree with that on my side. Mr. Kai, would you like to say anything to that comment or to elaborate?
No, absolutely. And I think this is to all of us. In this group, we have the dominant group here at the academic. I think the academia has a very important role to play. I myself have a very particular scientific interest in this important subject because I know this is the only way, if we are able to, for us to be able to address some of the challenges with implementation. For me, as somebody working in policy level, I'm very much concerned that these policies are not being implemented at grassroots level. And one of the constraints would be that that we are not actually working together with the communities, including making the use of their knowledge. And as long as we continue with this, there is going to be a gap between the policies implementation and the policies themselves. So absolutely, we need to have more research. And I think the academia has a very important role to play.
No, thank you for that. I completely agree. I think one of the challenges that we certainly have as academic units is that very often, a lot of the time, when it comes to funding for research, we are told to do very large research projects, projects that often look at disaster risk at, say, national or regional levels, and a lot of the time there's very limited funding and support for doing research at more localized levels, because as much as disaster risk is a transboundary issue that can affect multiple countries, we also have to take into account that they are localized micro differences between communities in terms of their vulnerability, in terms of their risk. And I think understanding that indigenous knowledge about understanding people's vulnerabilities, but also how they cope, is very crucial. I see Dominic Ayegba Okoliko has his hand up. Dominic, would you like to ask Mr. Kai a question?
Hello, good afternoon, everyone from my end. So firstly, I would like to thank Mr. Kai for the presentation and for highlighting the importance of indigenous knowledge regarding how communities in Africa make sense and also engage climate risk. My concern is how much of these conversation or dialogue concerning indigenous knowledge is filtered into public space through communication, especially the media. My research looks at climate change communication in Africa, and so far our project particularly have analyzed newspaper publications on climate change from 3 countries in Africa: South Africa, Nigeria, and Kenya. And one of the things we found that were very interesting to us was the low intake of indigenous knowledge in these spaces. And as you rightly acknowledged, it is important for communities to see how much of resilience and how much of generational knowledge about risk management and hazards, dealing with hazards, is being taken up in the public space. So I want to gauge the speaker's interest, especially with relation to public space discussion on indigenous knowledge.
Well, Dominic, absolutely. I mean, as I was preparing for this topic, for this discussion, I tried to move around to see what is available information. There is very limited information when it comes to African indigenous knowledge. A lot has been done in some countries, in Kenya, also some countries in Southern Africa, but really they are very much limited to agriculture, not really very clearly on whether communities are actually saying, oh, the changing disaster risk context is becoming a big problem, and it's not coming out. And I'm sure they might be suffering in silence. So they may be knowing a lot. And this aspect of communication is also very important. So this work in tandem actually with the scientific. Although our own definition, as Dr. Tabo said, our own definition of science actually includes our African way of doing things. This is also very, very problematic. So, but I think that the media has a very important role. In a recent years, we have been working with the only credible media organization. I mean, not credible such. I'm not saying credible, but all media organizations are credible. But the only organization of journalists dedicated to disaster risk reduction, DIRAJ, has been working with us very closely. And I think what you are raising, Dominic, is very important, that we also engage the media in ensuring that this aspect of indigenous knowledge is really dominating. It is quite unfortunate that some of the countries don't even want to mention the word indigenous knowledge. The last regional platform we had in Tunisia, we had to remove it because the ministers could not agree on the use of indigenous knowledge, because some countries were feeling that was divisive in nature. But leaving politics aside, whatever name they can call it, I think that is really a need to make sure that this is communicated in public spaces. Back to you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kai. There is another question from Dorothy Heinrich. It's a little bit up the chat because a lot of people have been posting things on there, but her question is, it's very close to Jalali's question, well, not close to Jalali, it's a little bit up the chat way, but her question is, thank you very much for this insightful conversation. I'm curious whether anyone here has experience working with African Indigenous knowledge with humanitarian actors, and whether there might be any suggestions or advice for humanitarians to engage with these topics going forward. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, Mr. Kai.
Sorry, Alberto. I think I had some bit of interaction.
Oh, no problem.
Yeah, is a question from Dorothy? Is that correct?
It's from Dorothy. Yes.
I think this is a question to all of us. I don't know. I have never worked. I work in a humanitarian setting for a very long time, but we use indigenous knowledge with regard to conflict management, using rituals for forgiveness and reconciling communities, but not really on disaster risk reduction. If somebody could share their experience, that would be really very good.
Absolutely, and just to echo what Mr. Kai is saying, is I really do encourage everyone to use the chat to make connections, to share links. If anyone has an answer to Dorothy's question about their experiences, please feel free to message her in the chat. There's another question. Actually, no, sorry. I noticed that Tabo Joda, your hand is up again. Would you like to? I'm not sure. You did say in the chat that you're having a weak network, but if you would like to try and chat, to ask a question out loud or to say something, you're more than welcome to.
Hello.
Yes, hi. We can hear you.
Okay, I'm sorry. I'm actually in transit and I'm having challenges with network, but I want to really appreciate the very lucid and wonderful presentation by Kai. It sends a very strong message of hope in my heart. Being everly concerned about the issues of indigenous knowledge and its use, and of course, its complete integration in the processes of designing our policies around climate and so on. So 3 things I wanted to just highlight on is first, there is a critical mass of indigenous knowledge available around our African continent. Unfortunately, like Kai said, the incidents of the incident we had in Tunisia when we had to look at mainstreaming these into the policy outcome, or the discussions outcome, it was a challenge. So it is similarly what is actually happening with so many national governments. That's why it is difficult to have concerted documents or any data that is so well arranged and called perhaps named as indigenous knowledge. That is one. Example in Tunisia is a very good example that we need to look at. And then of course, be able to also advise that this is not intended to be a divisive tool or any divisive material whatsoever. Like I said, it's very important that we look at it out of politics as a critical development tool or aspect that helps in enhancing or accelerating most of the targets that we have. For instance, now we've seen a lot about the research gaps. Like many of the people have mentioned the research gaps that we are having. How many people are researching on indigenous knowledge? First, it is very difficult to say someone from the academia to research on indigenous knowledge because the entire way of doing or way of thinking, the sociology of most of the indigenous communities have a completely very different way of approach to knowledge compared to the modern education system that we all practice. For instance, now earthquake. Have you seen any serious professor who is studying earthquake or any serious research around earthquakes, how earthquakes are managed, and how earthquakes are actually reduced or the impact of earthquakes reduced? But if you go into the communities where these earthquakes often happen, you discover that these earthquakes actually happen with very limited impact on the people in terms of physical injury. The people already have a way of understanding when these earthquakes are coming. There's a traditional or indigenous early warning system that they understand it. But where is the research on this? It doesn't exist, but the practice exists on the ground. So the challenge here is that there is no concerted research or concerted communication material that actually brings this into discussions. At the same time, for instance, we are currently going through the COVID menace. So the main thing now is people should stay home. That's the advice. But you can see our weakness as a modern people. But you see the resilience of communities, the local communities, or the indigenous people using indigenous knowledge right now. And this is a very good example for us to use now, because if we always staying at home, the local farmers growing tomatoes, the local hunters producing, the local artisans doing different roles that they're actually carrying out right now in producing some of the results or some of the food that we are all having on our tables. What do you think would have happened if they were also staying home? So where is resilience? Where is the best resilience? Where are we seeing the practice of resilience? It is right there in the indigenous communities. So to say, you can't give what you don't have. So modern science has its own space and indigenous knowledge has its own space. So the distinction between these two must be very clear, and the importance of both also should be well spelled out in our conversations and in our policy documents. So that's why I agree with Kai's recommendation that this has to really be well mainstream and streamlined, which is very key. And then the last subject I was going to, the last point I was going to raise was, it is just important for us to start looking at the value and the necessity of indigenous knowledge and its use in planning, in policy, and of course in the processes of designing some of the strategies that we often probably neglect indigenous knowledge in. That will help us in creating or perhaps accelerating some of the implementation. I've given just an example of currently COVID now. Who are the people on the field working? So let's learn from these people. Let's learn from the indigenous knowledge, and this can help us even accelerate further in achieving the Sendai Framework and the other climate frameworks that we have. Perhaps this should be a way for us to know how important it is. I am an indigenous person, and I promote indigenous practices and indigenous knowledge very well, and I stand very strong to say that this is time for us to raise the bar and raise our interest in this direction. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Jordan. That was some very excellent points, and I think we all really enjoyed your enthusiasm and your passion for promoting indigenous knowledge. And I think we can all agree that it's something that really does need a lot more support, and it needs a lot more emphasis placed on it. Just quickly looking, we haven't got too much time left. I think maybe we have time for one more question. I'm just quickly checking through the chats. If there's a question that maybe came out. Mr. Kai, I'm not sure if you maybe want to, if there was anything in the comments in the chat that that you saw that maybe you want to speak about. I know that a lot of people are just putting down, they sort of just suggesting things. Nigel Crowhall from UNESCO has put in some very interesting comments about that there was a community of practice. Is it the Doha community of practice? Oh no, is that Conference of Parties, sorry. There was a roundtable led by humanitarian organizations. They are often sitting on a lot of information and learning on adaptation, including the application of indigenous knowledge and local knowledge in DRR. Adama Bamba from the African Youth Advisory Board, he says he also thinks that policy should be developed in such a way that can be understandable by rural communities. That would help to collect African indigenous knowledge, useful to overcome our shocks and challenges with scientific knowledge. And I think maybe just something from my side is that I think that's also a challenge as well with regards to when one gathers knowledge, is whether a lot of this knowledge also is given back to the people, that where this knowledge is gained from. I know that from our perspective at our University of Stellenbosch, what we always try and do is that whenever we're doing research, we always try and make it locally relevant, and we always ensure that when we create a report, when we whatever data we gather, we try and share it with the communities that we've gathered this data from. And we also try to ensure that when we provide them with this data and this information, it's data that they can use, and then it's in a language that they can understand. And I'm not just talking about localized languages, but also sometimes people are very intimidated by overly scientific language. And I think that can also be a challenge, is that sometimes you provide data, but then the people sort of think, well, what can I do with this? This doesn't necessarily help me. And I think that's something that also needs to be a major aspect of sort of helping to acquire indigenous knowledge, is to ensure that the knowledge that one gets can be given back to communities so that they can utilize it. And not just the community that you're helping, but other communities in similar situations, I think. Sorry, I took over there a little bit, but Mr. Kai, I think we're just about at the end of our session. I don't know if you have any last comments or any last thoughts that you'd like to share with everyone.
Well, looking at some of the last comments from Edwin, it's actually a question that how do we integrate climate change management with disaster risk management? As at the moment, they are looked at separately. As I mentioned very early, is that the reason also why we also need to empower local communities is to also deal away with some of this duplication that we have. I think we tend to be innovative, which is very good, but we tend to be creating names that mean the same thing. And I think this is really creating more duplications. And if you have a time to sit back and look at the current naming of things, you'll have 3, 4, 5 things that are meaning the same thing. And when it comes to actual implementation on the ground, they actually mean one thing. And having community perspective is strengthened. will actually help us to address some of these gaps. And where there are major differences, I think we'll find a way of ensuring that there is integration. We have been talking for years the need to integrate climate change and disaster risk reduction, because all of them are addressing a risk. They're addressing a disaster risk, whether that risk is because of climate change, whether that is geological hazard, or whether that is fire or anthropogenic. I mean, they all address risk, and they're all building resilience. So I think this is really, I don't think we're going to find a solution bringing this together. We have talked enough, and we haven't seen more disintegration. Even at DRM, there is more disintegration. That is single way of, even in countries, you have different institutions dealing with drought, others are dealing with flooding, others are dealing with earthquake. This sort of single hazard approach and silo approach is really worsening. And I think this is a time really we need to bring on board different communities, different aspects, stakeholders, to address some of these challenges. And I think, of course, the comment from my brother, Adama, that it is important that we start developing policies in a language that is understandable to the communities. This is absolutely very clear. And of course, we have been working with JODA. JODA will continue to work together to ensure that these aspects are brought to surface. What I would just like to say is that we all have a responsibility to recognize, our own way of doing things. And I think there is a lot of wisdom that we can bring to science. We are not saying that you throw away the science. I mean, the scientific way of doing things has evolved. And if it was an indigenous thinking, maybe from the West, I think it has now become global, and it has now taken on board so many ideas from other communities. We also have our own African way of doing things that make us unique. And I think that is the only way we'll be able to reconnect with our communities. And that is the only way also we'll be able now to understand science better and try to integrate the Western-centric scientific views with the African indigenous way of doing things. And in that way, it will strengthen our position, even in global discourses. And I think this is the way to go. It's not only that need to be done, it's not the role of government alone. I think all of us have a role to play. As I said earlier, the academia has taken a lead, and we have seen several institutions establishing indigenous departments. And then again, it is important that we have our organization, the civil society, like what is led by JODA, to be empowered to lead documentation of this kind of knowledge at grassroots. And of course, they have to be tested. We are not saying they're all relevant. Some of them are actually not relevant, but I think we can take the most relevant ones to inform discourses on climate change and disaster risk reduction. As I said, I'm available, and I think we in the future will be continue to organizing this kind of session as we continue to advance in understanding some of these complex issues. Thank you so much for your kind attention, and back to you, Alberto.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kai, and thank you so much for your final thoughts there. I think they're very poignant, and I think, as you say, academia has come a long way to try and to improve upon indigenous knowledge, and I certainly think a lot of the people here are very involved in academic institutions. So hopefully we can continue to fight the good fight on behalf of improving upon and enhancing and providing more opportunities for indigenous knowledge to really come to the front, and to really try and use this information to try and enhance resilience and reduce vulnerability across the continent. Mr. Kai, I just want to say thank you very much for having us on board today. It's always a pleasure speaking to you. And thank you so much for giving up an hour of your time to speak to everyone today. And thank you very much to all the participants for joining us today, for asking such amazing questions, and for being part of this process. So with PERIPERI U Talks, we will be posting this recording on our YouTube page a little bit later today. You can find out more information on our website, www.riskreductionafrica.org, to find out more about ourselves, more about our PERIPERI U Talks session. And yes, I just want to again say thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. And I hope that everyone has a wonderful rest of your day. Mr. Kai, thank you again so much for joining us. And we hope to chat to you again soon. And to the participants, I hope to see you again in future PERIPERI U sessions. We do have a session next week. We're just waiting for our participants to come back to us with their final draft. But we will be going on with PERIPERI Talks up until the end of June. And then we'll probably be re-beginning in July with a whole new series of speakers. So again, thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. We really appreciate having you on board, and have a wonderful rest of your day.